Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible. All right, I'm Pooja Mathur, and on behalf of CSR Box and the Habitats Trust, I welcome all of you today to the third Habitats Trust Grants Symposium. Thank you for joining us today. I'm sure many of you have been a part of our previous symposiums as well, but for those who are new, I'd like to give a quick introduction. As partner and co-host with the Habitats Trust, we are conducting Pan-India virtual symposiums in an effort to bring together individuals, organizations, researchers, and policymakers on one platform, such that they can deliberate upon how individuals and organizations can contribute towards conservation of sustainable ecosystems. The objective of these symposiums is to stir discussion regarding the protection and conservation of India's lesser known natural habitats and indigenous species of flora and fauna, as well as to inform individuals and organizations about the Habitats Trust grants and its application process. We hope you will find the program we have lined up for you to be fruitful and engaging. To begin, please join me in welcoming Tanya Singh from the Habitats Trust to help us with an overview of the grants that the Habitats Trust is offering, the eligibility and evaluation criteria, and the selection process for the 4 grant categories. Tanya, over to you.
Thank you, Pooja. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Tanya from the Habitats Trust Grants team. To begin with, I would like to give you a brief overview about the Habitats Trust and then run you through the details about our flagship program, the Habitats Trust Grants. Next. So the Habitats Trust was founded 3 years ago in 2018 by Roshni Nadar Malhotra, the chairperson of HCL Technologies, and Shikhar Malhotra, the executive director and board member of HCL Corporation, who are both extremely passionate about wildlife and conservation. The aim of the Habitats Trust is to protect India's natural habitats and its indigenous species of flora and fauna by establishing strategic partnerships, by focusing on on-ground efforts, by engaging technology for conservation, and through conservation awareness generation. We aim to provide support and recognition to passionate grassroots conservationists across the country and work towards innovative, sustainable, and replicable conservation initiatives on ground to secure our habitats and species. The mission of the Habitats Trust is to create and conserve sustainable ecosystems across India through strategic partnerships and collaborations with all stakeholders at every level. Next. Now coming to our flagship program, the Habitats Trust Grants. In this presentation, I will run you through an overview about the grants, our past recipients, the eligibility criteria, and the evaluation process. Next. So the Habitats Trust grants were also initiated in 2018 with an aim to recognize and support organizations and individuals working tirelessly in the field to protect our natural habitats and indigenous species. Under the grants program, we invite applications in 4 categories, 3 for organizations and 1 for individuals. For organizations, we have the Strategic Partnership Grant amounting to 35 lakhs, the Lesser Known Habitats Grant amounting to 30 lakhs, and the Lesser Known Species Grant for 25 lakhs. For individuals, we have the Conservation Hero Grant amounting 15 lakh rupees. Over the years, we have increased our grant values too. Also this year onwards, the grants will be administered over a duration of 2 years instead of 1. We felt that this would help us in increasing the conservation impact of our projects on ground. I would also like to mention that towards the end of our grants application process, 2 finalists in each category are awarded 10% of the grant value to support their conservation efforts. Next. As you can see on this slide, the Habitats Trust grants are getting more and more competitive with an increased number of proposals being received every year. In 2020, we received the highest number of registrations and applications, about 4,311 and 561 respectively. Next. Okay. In this slide, you can see our presence in different parts of the country. I would like to mention that the largest number of applications received under the grants come from the Northeast region of India, the Western Ghats, and parts of Southern India. And this is reflected in our active projects as well, as you can see on the map. Our strategic partnership grant partners are denoted by the dark blue color. Towards the west, we have the Corbett Foundation working in Abdasa, Greater Run of Kutch. Towards the northeast, we have Aranyak working in Manas National Park, Assam. And then we have Foundation for Ecological Security working in Nagaland. Our lesser known habitats partners are denoted by the green color on the map. In Tamil Nadu, we have Seeds Trust working in the Ayalur habitat. Towards the west, in Goa, we have Coastal Impact, and Reef Watch Marine Conservation have their project based out of the Andaman Islands. Our lesser known species grant partners are denoted by the orangish color on the map. The Bat Conservation India Trust works in Kolar district in Karnataka. The Metastring Foundation works in different parts of the Western Ghats, whereas Sahyadri Nisarga Mitra have been working in Konkan region of the Western Ghats. In yellow, we have our conservation hero partners, M. Suraj working in Chhattisgarh and Niti Mahesh working in Coorg in Karnataka. Next. In its first edition in 2018, the Habitats Trust grants awarded 50 lakh to organizations working to protect India's biodiversity. Our strategic partnership grant recipient, Foundation for Ecological Security, has been working to strengthen governance and management of community conserved areas in Nagaland. They aim to ensure protection of endangered and threatened species like Blitz tragopan, Hoolock gibbon, the Chinese pangolin, and the Great Indian hornbill in 3 selected landscapes in Nagaland. Our lesser known habitats grant partner, Reef Watch Marine Conservation, has been working on rehabilitating coral reefs in Andaman Islands. Our lesser known species grant partner, Sahyadri Nisarga Mitra, is working on protection of the world's most trafficked mammal, the Indian pangolin, through community participation in the Konkan region. Next. In the second edition in 2019, we awarded 70 lakh to organizations. Our strategic partnership grant partner, Aranyak, has been working on restoring the habitat of the last surviving wild population of pygmy hawks. Their project aims to secure and recover Manas grasslands and its threatened species. Our lesser known habitat grant partner, Coastal Impact, has been working on coral transplantation aids for preservation of coral patches off the coast of Goa. Our lesser known species grant partner, the Metastring Foundation, has been assessing the conservation status and needs of the Malabar tree toad through citizen-based field surveys. And lastly, our conservation hero grant partner, Niti Mahesh, has been working on reviving traditional knowledge to restore the riparian habitat along the Kaveri River in Coorg in Karnataka. Next. So last year, we also awarded 70 lakh to dedicated conservationists. We have the Corbett Foundation, who are working on conservation and recovery of the Great Indian Bustard. Seeds Trust is working along with tribals to conserve the Ayalur habitat and its biodiversity in Tamil Nadu. We have Bat Conservation India Trust, who are working towards preventing the extinction of the Kolar leaf-nosed bat. And lastly, we have M. Suraj, who is conducting anti-snare walks in protected areas of Chhattisgarh to curb poaching. To give you a brief overview about their work, you can check out their videos that we're now going to play.
With just 150 birds recorded worldwide, the Great Indian Bustard is on the brink of extinction. In India, the Kutch district of Gujarat is one of the last viable habitats, though only an all-female population of 6 individuals remain here. Their protected habitat in Kutch is limited to just 2 square kilometers, so these birds rely on the community grasslands of more than 40 villages in the area for their survival. The Corbett Foundation, which has been working to conserve the bustard in India, proposes to secure Great Indian Bustard habitats in Kutch by engaging the local communities residing within a 220 square kilometer radius of the core bustard habitat through awareness and capacity building programs for better grassland management. The forests of Ayalur in Tamil Nadu are a lifeline for the communities that live alongside these forests and depend on them for their livelihoods. They're also home to an elusive and threatened primate, the grey slender loris. Anthropogenic usage beyond the natural regeneration capacity has degraded these forests, affecting both species diversity and tribal livelihoods. Seeds Trust has been working in Ayalur for over 2 decades with the vision of enabling local communities to become self-reliant and to conserve natural resources. Under the project, Seeds Trusts aim to reduce pressures on the Ayalur habitat by providing training to the communities on sustainable harvesting and cattle grazing methods. The rare and endemic kola leaf nose bat is found today in only one cave of Kolar district of Karnataka, where their numbers have decreased to just 150 to 200 individuals. Change in land use, stone quarrying, and rampant hunting for perceived medicinal purposes are driving these bats closer to extinction. Lack of information about the species is a major hurdle to conservation efforts. Bat Conservation India Trust has proposed an in-depth research to understand the behavior and ecological needs of the kola leaf nose bat so that necessary steps can be taken to protect them. Snares, used by both organized poaching syndicates and local hunters, pose a grave threat to wildlife in the protected areas of Chhattisgarh, which is among the hotspots for hunting and wildlife trade in India. For the past 9 years, M. Suraj has been working alongside authorities in Chhattisgarh to curb poaching and sensitize the community on the need to protect biodiversity. Under the project, he proposes to conduct anti-snare walks in hunting zones and train frontline forest staff and local community champions on anti-snaring activities.
Thank you so much, Deepak. Everyone can also visit our YouTube channel to check out these videos and many more about our past recipients. Now coming to the eligibility criteria for the grants. Next. Yeah. So due to time constraints, I will only be able to go through this briefly. We strongly recommend you to visit our website and study the grant guidelines to thoroughly understand the eligibility criteria for the different categories. This will also help you determine what is the best category suited for the project you would like to propose. Please note that each grant category has been designed to address a specific conservation need of the country. To begin with, the Strategic Partnership Grant. So this is primarily for mid to large size field work oriented organizations who have an annual expenditure of at least 50 lakhs. The organization also must have completed 5 years of functional existence by March 2021 to be eligible to apply under this category. The grant is directed towards catering to the running costs of on-ground projects and also to create a two-way partnership between the Habitats Trust and the organization. The lesser known Habitats Grant is designed to pay attention to overlooked and unaddressed habitats across India that need urgent conservation attention and care. And through this grant, we hope to bring these vital overlooked habitats into spotlight. To apply in this category, the organization must have completed 2 years of functional existence before March 2021. Our next category, the lesser known species grant, aims to provide conservation support to various lesser known endangered species of flora and fauna in India. You can have a look at our grant guidelines to get an idea of the indicative list of these species. Or the species you would like to propose to protect should be enlisted as threatened or data deficit as per the IUCN Red List or on Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act of India. While a lot of attention is bestowed upon the charismatic species of the country, such as tigers, lions, leopards, rhinos, this grant aims to bring species that are equally endangered and ecologically important, but unfortunately not well known into the spotlight. The organization applying for this category must have completed 2 years of functional existence by March 2021. Lastly, the Conservation Hero Grant. It aims to champion the work of grassroots individual conservationists working dedicatedly with little or no support to protect India's biodiversity. The grant provides them a platform to expand their activities and garner further support for their work in conservation. While this grant is open to all individuals, it is important to note that these individuals should not be full-time employees or board members of any registered not-for-profit entity in India. Besides this, it's important to note that projects that engage the local communities in their efforts will be given preference. The organizations applying must be a registered not-for-profit entity in India, that is either a society, a trust, a Section 8, which was previously a Section 25 company, or a registered institute under Section 35(1)(2). Again, I would like to mention that you should carefully read all the grant guidelines given on our website before applying. Next. Yeah, now we come to the evaluation process. Next. Okay. Listed here are the key evaluation criteria, basis which your application would be evaluated. It is very important to keep these factors in mind while designing your project and writing your proposal. Number one, the problem statement. This should justify the need of the proposed project, taking into account the on-ground reality and existing conservation efforts in the proposed location. Number two, relevance. Does your proposed project address key conservation issues, taking into account the context of the project location, that is the population distributions, habitat conservation, and existing and upcoming threats, wildlife populations, involvement of stakeholders, etc. The methodology. Is there a pragmatic methodology to achieve the proposed objectives? Is there sufficient portion of the budget dedicated to carrying out the proposed activities? Are the activities methodologies well thought out and based on experience and research? Now coming to the expected conservation impact. How strong is the expected on-ground impact of the proposed project? And are there any measures or indicators in place to assess the impact of the project? Then monitoring, evaluation, and documentation. How do you plan to monitor your project on an ongoing basis? Then stakeholder engagement. Does the project reach out to key stakeholders such as the forest department, enforcement agencies, local communities, farmers, students, etc.? Sustainability. Do you have a long-term strategy behind your proposed project? And does the proposal have a component of sustainability? Do you have strong fundraising skills? Does the proposed project fall into the current conservation context, enabling you to further the work? And lastly, coming to replicability, can the project be replicated on a large or small scale while based at different locations? Also beyond this, you will be evaluated upon your capacity to deliver your project and also similar past experience. Next. In this slide, we will talk about the evaluation process, about the Habitats Trust grants. The recipients of the grants are selected through a structured, robust, and a very transparent process. In the first round, we have the first level screening and shortlisting. Successfully submitted applications and applicants will be screened for eligibility, relevance of answers, and authenticity of information. A team of experts, including sector specialists and external auditors, evaluate the successful entries, after which 28 shortlisted applications move to the field level verification. In the field level verification round, the Habitats Trust team visits the project sites for shortlisted applicants who are screened further for relevance and expected impact of their proposed project. Basis this, qualitative and quantitative scores are assigned to each applicant. In the third round, the sub-jury panelists shortlist 3 applicants in each category and also keep in mind the field level verification scores. Another level of due diligence is conducted at this stage by our grant audit partners, after which in the last stage, the applicants present their proposed projects to the Habitats Trust grants jury. Next. Well, actually, that's all from my side. Please let us know if you have any queries in the Q&A section below, or you can also directly email us. You can also log into our website to know more about us and to also go through all the grant guidelines. And thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. And over to you, Pooja.
Thank you, Tanya, for that crisp overview. Next up, we have a really exciting masterclass curated just for you, focusing on the role of technology in conservation. Now, I'm sure it's safe to say that we all heavily consume technology in some form or the other, and its effects are felt by virtually everyone on the planet. In the space of conservation too, we have come a long way to harnessing technology as a means for driving innovation and solutions. From camera traps to satellites to acoustics to drones, conservation technology has become increasingly crucial for observation, communication, and mapping for conservation of wildlife and habitats. To talk more in this context and facilitate this session, I would like to invite Mr. Shashank Srinivasan, founder and director at Technology for Wildlife. Shashank is a conservation geographer and drone pilot. He is the founder and director at Technology for Wildlife, which works with conservation practitioners to amplify their impact through appropriate use of modern technology. He has an MRS in ecology and environmental management from the University of York and an MPhil in conservation leadership from the University of Cambridge. He is a National Geographic Explorer, HSBC Chevening Scholar, and a Kinship Conservation Fellow. We welcome you, Shashank, and look forward to an engaging session.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Pooja. I'm going to jump right into it. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of what my talk today is going to be about. I'm going to talk about one and possibly two case studies of our work in the past couple of years using technology for conservation. And I have a couple of slides at the end about why, if you're running a conservation organization, you might want to consider using technology for your work itself. So to jump into the presentation itself. Great. Yeah, so as Pooja has mentioned and so kindly introduced me, I'm the director at Technology for Wildlife. And today's talk, I'm going to talk about the role of technology itself in conservation. A bit more about my organization. So essentially, we amplify conservation impact. That's a mission statement. And we do this through the appropriate use of modern technology. And appropriate here is really important because we aren't technology evangelists. And I don't think that using technology just for the sake of it is something anyone should be doing, especially in a discipline as sensitive and important as conservation, which we're all in. For more information on the organization itself, you can visit our website, which is up there on the presentation, the link is there, as well as we have quite active Twitter and Instagram accounts as well, which at least the Instagram has lots of interesting images which are worth looking at. The two areas we focus on as Technology for Wildlife are geospatial data analysis and robot operations. So we operate both aerial as well as underwater robots for conservation, and we do a lot of mapping work. We've also consulted on various other conservation technologies, but our domain expertise lies in these two regions. So the first project I talk about is something called Machine Perspectives of Alien Landscapes. So this was a project in Ladakh in 2019, which is supported by grants from the National Geographic Society. And essentially, the goal of this expedition, of this project itself, was to explore these high altitude lake ecosystems which we find in Ladakh, and also look for signs of plastic pollution. The conservation outcomes, which it's important to articulate before you start any project, were to collect media and data for research purposes, to conduct policy advocacy, to engage with local communities, and to help in long-term conservation planning for these ecosystems. So what did we collect? We collected beautiful images of the landscapes, which have already been used for advocacy and communication by various other partners. We collected high-resolution wetland maps. Both these maps, again, of different sections of the lake shores have been collected using drones up in Ladakh. We also use them, and we are collaborating with a couple of scientists now to actually see if we can distinguish pika and marmot burrows using the imagery itself. So again, we had gone with one purpose, collected lots of data for that purpose, but there are always secondary things we can do with data for conservation as well. So this is an example of that, where we're actually trying to see whether we can look at population densities, look at like habitat use by rodent species up in Ladakh. We've engaged with local communities, showing them aerial photographs, aerial video of their herding areas, of their homes itself, something they haven't seen before. It's also important to engage with communities so that they understand exactly what's happening, because at least with new technology, it might be difficult for people to understand what you're doing, for them to understand how intrusive the inappropriate use of such technology can be. So it's really important to actually try and educate, make people aware, bring them on board, and have them actually buy into your projects as well, especially with new tech again. So the actual research itself, so we use the drones to collect lots of imagery along the lakeshore, and we can actually use it to quantify plastic in and around the lakeshore itself. We also use underwater robots, like I mentioned earlier. So we can also actually look for plastic underwater. So this plastic bag is up in Ladakh under a lake bed. So it's maybe about half a meter underwater, a few meters offshore. But there is plastic in those waters. And again, I think this is the first footage we have from underwater up in these lakes. We also collected some video footage of these small amphipods, their gamete day in the lakes itself. So again, from what I understand, the first underwater footage from Ladakh of these creatures. So that's what they look like. Again, just living the life 4,500 meters above sea level on the bottom of a lake bed. So the robots itself, so we use aerial robots. So this is one of the aerial robots we have. It's a DJI Mavic 2 Pro, which we've named Arva. So this is what we use for collecting video for mapping purposes as well. And then we have an underwater robot, which is a SOFAR Ocean Trident named Varaha. So we have two of these particular devices right now, which we're using both for freshwater work as well as for marine work. The other project which I talk about is actually very recent. We only completed this about 2 weeks ago, and this is about documenting turtle nesting beaches. So the reason I'm showing this one to all the participants in today's webinar is to just show how fast it is possible to do work if you're using technology appropriately. So this particular project itself was in collaboration with WWF and the Goa Forest Department. And the idea was to use aerial robots to create high resolution maps of these beaches to again look for plastic, collect lots of compelling aerial imagery and video, and to conduct test transects for future work around turtle surveys in Goa and other parts of the country as well. Again, outcomes were very clear: advocacy, community engagement, conservation planning. This is what a olive ridley turtle hatchling looks like. So these hatchlings emerged on the 3rd of March, which is the day we were doing our project work itself. This is what the beach where they emerged looks like. So this is Morji Beach in North Goa. So you can see in the foreground of the image, there are shacks with sunbeds and small tables set up outside. And on the far end of the beach is where the turtles come to nest, that's where the forest department has their turtle center itself. This is what a map of the entire beach looks like. So all of this imagery for this particular map was collected between the 3rd and the 5th of March. And we actually had high quality, high resolution maps ready by the 7th of March. So within 48 hours, you can actually do an operation using drones, create a map of a particular area and actually have it production ready at the end of that as well. So again, just to go back and forth between these two images, you've got your shacks over here, and you can see the little green shacks in the medium distance. That's the turtle nesting center, which is what shows up here on this map on the top left, right? So just to give you context. So but between that image, this map and many other images and maps, we can actually provide very good context of where turtles come out to nest. And we also have data on the nest locations of the turtles. We can actually look at them on a drone image and figure out, okay, are turtles picking certain areas? Are they moving away from certain areas? So that's the kind of research you can do with drone imagery. So why use conservation technology itself? That's an important question. For us, it seems quite self-evident because, again, we're using drones, we're using satellite imagery, we're doing lots of mapping work, so lots of computer hardware and software required as well. So we couldn't really do our work itself without conservation technology. But in any other domain as well, whether it's with camera traps, whether it's with like solar fences, the main reason to use technology for conservation is because it can actually make research and interventions more effective and efficient. So before using any technology for projects, whatever the form of technology, it's really important to see whether it will actually make things better or will it make things worse, because both are possible. So a large part of our work at Technology for Wildlife is actually making those assessments, understanding how tech should be used appropriately and where it should not be used at all for conservation. There's lots of research being done on this as well. I can discuss that further in the question and answer session if that's of interest. But the ethical use of technology is very important, especially in conservation. Okay, I can't re-emphasize that point often enough. To go on to a slightly more organizational perspective of technology for conservation, from my experience, these are the barriers to actually using tech for conservation within organizations. This applies to India, to the global south, but it also applies to the global north. Right. So again, it will vary depending on access to resources and cultural context, but this is again a broad summary of it. Again, most of the grantees for the Habitats Trust are, are going to fall somewhere on the scale on this particular scale. We're not expecting very large organizations to be applying, but again, if you are a grantee or a potential grantee with the Habitats Trust, keep this in mind if you're looking at technology. So the first is, if you're a very small organization, you might not know what technology is available and what you need to use for your projects. Again, you might have the information, but then you might not have access to funding. You might have the information and the access to funding, but that doesn't mean you have access to the technical skill sets required to actually do something. Because again, skilled people can be hard to find, especially around technology. There's skill required both in terms of operating technology, but also around managing data and acquiring permissions to actually use the technology in the first place. The larger the organization becomes, they might have the information, the funding, the technical skills as well, but it also brings about a pressure to use technology, which can then lead to its inappropriate use, which can actually harm the conservation outcomes which are desired. I've seen organizations also invest a lot of time and effort in research and development. And again, as a rule of thumb, in conservation where funds are constrained, it makes sense to first explore any off-the-shelf technology available before committing to actually building new technology yourself. So for us, for example, we looked into building drones, into working with drone manufacturers. It turns out it's much easier from a permission perspective, from a funding perspective as well, to just buy off-the-shelf technology or lease it as required. And finally, with the largest of organizations, again, they've got all the other things in place, but they might have a duplication of effort. So for example, everyone wants to build an app. Sometimes there are already existing apps out there which just need to be modified a little bit to actually get your conservation outcome. So essentially, don't build things just for the sake of building them. Really think through why you're doing it, and then you'll really have a positive conservation outcome at the end of it. So finally, I'll leave you with these 3 quotes from science fiction authors and scientists, researchers in this context. So the first is from Arthur C. Clarke, where he says any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And it really can feel that way sometimes. When you're using a drone, looking at a satellite image, which was, a satellite flew overhead yesterday, for example. I downloaded the image this morning, and I can actually see what's happened between yesterday and last week, right? It's magical, unthinkable even like 40 or 50 years ago, and today it's just so easy to do. Following on that is William Gibson's quote, which is, no matter how magical it might all seem, the fact is that the future, it's here, but it's not evenly distributed. So keep that in mind when using technology, because again, in India, lots of people have smartphones, not everyone does yet. People can use drones for conservation, but not everyone can actually access the benefits of that. So to really, again, keep that in mind when using technology. And finally is by Kentaro Toyama. So he's a researcher currently at Michigan Ann Arbor, but he used to head Microsoft Research India in the past. So he's lots of work in the development sector around technology. He's done a lot of work in this area, but what I would say to really take away from today's talk is that technology only amplifies underlying human intent and capacity. That's very clear. That means that if people want to do harm, technology will help them do harm better. Right, it's something to keep in mind when looking at anti-poaching work, again around poachers using drones, for example, that comes across very clearly, but it's also unintentional harm. So for example, no matter how good our intentions, we can use technology to really amplify them, and we make a mistake, the scale of it can be quite hard to manage. So just keep all of these things in mind when actually thinking about technology in the conservation space. And that's my session anyway. So if there are any question and answers, I'll take them at this point of time. But for more information, again, check out our website, or you can email me at my email address up on that link as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shashank. There are a couple of questions for you in the chat box. I'll just read them out to you so that you can address them accordingly.
Sure.
All right. So the first questions comes from Shivani. What legal or policy challenges do you face in deploying tech like drones for conservation?
Okay, thanks for the question, Shivangi. So essentially, the gray area, the whole use of drones in India currently has been a legally gray area till very recently. It's now actually possible to use drones for conservation work as well. The permissions, though, as you've rightly pointed out, they do take time and effort to work through. So for us, we work with the forest department, we work with the local police, we work with the DGC in Delhi to actually make sure that we have everything in place to actually use drones for our work. Again, like it is an obstacle. The fact that you have to jump through so many hoops to actually use technology is means that it can be hard to actually do. But again, which is why it's important to really think through whether you need it or not. The policy wise, again, like I said, there's a gray area, but the regulations came out and have been authorized a week ago. So again, if you wanted to go through them to understand in detail about the use of drones in India, that's a good place to start. So these are the civil aviation regulations issued around unmanned aerial systems by the Directorate General of Civil Aviation last week.
Thanks, Shashank. There is another related question from Yash. He says, great talk, Shashank. I would like to know about the permissions needed for using drones in Ladakh, say away from the border in places such as Sokar Basin.
Great. Okay, thanks, Dr. Bhatnagar, for that question. Ladakh took us a lot of time for permission. It took us almost 3 months to get the permissions for the project we were doing. Because this was, again, before the regulations were authorized, we got permissions by working with the district administration directly, with the Army and the Air Force in Ladakh, as well as the relevant departments in Delhi. So again, lots of paperwork and lots of back and forth, but a bundle of letters from 4 or 5 different agencies who handle national security issues in Ladakh before we got permission. But that's what we needed to do for Ladakh specifically.
All right, great. There is another question from Sangamitra. She says, hey, impressive work on turtle nesting. Hope you guys, do you guys work on beaches of Odisha as well, which is house to many nesting areas of particularly olive ridley turtles?
Thanks, Sangamitra. We are hoping to work in Odisha as well. We are trying to figure out what the permissions are like for the various turtle nesting beaches of Odisha. But it's definitely something on our agenda because, again, I've been to one nesting event. It wasn't a mass nesting, but I'm very excited about actually using drones to do turtle population estimation with large numbers of turtles.
All right, Priyali asks, in dealing with wildlife, how difficult is it to adjust them with the technology?
So that's a really good question. The fact is that, again, a technological device is an intrusion. So you want to make sure that you can actually make that it's not disturbing your target species in any way at all. So for example, for drones, the legal flying height in India, unless you get waivers, is about 66 meters. With some of the drones which are out in the market right now, at that height is very hard to hear them. There have been numerous studies done about this in the West. So for example, there's one about how grizzly bears in Canada, if a drone flies overhead, they don't look at them. They appear not to notice them, but their heart rate spikes. So that's, again, really important to actually study properly. And the only way to do it is to actually do the field research required to understand that better.
All right, there are a couple of questions regarding affordability of using drones. I'll just read them out to you.
Sure.
One is written anonymously. Is it financially sound to conduct anti-poaching survey, say by a forest department using a drone? And what is the cost of leasing or purchasing a drone? And another question related one is there any technology which seeks less investment to observe a plant or a tree 24/7 involving students and community?
Okay, so let me answer the question from Apagi Nanda first about the technology for plant and tree monitoring, because that's an easy one in that I don't know the answer, but the people who do would be the Nature Conservation Foundation. They have a program called Season Watch. So again, like I would say to reach out to the Nature Conservation Foundation, because they would definitely, this is an area they would be very interested and I'm sure happy to help out with as well. To answer the question about the financial affordability of it, the price of drones, like again, most technology falls drastically year on year. Okay, so this is based on something called Moore's law from the 1970s about how the cost of microchips and computing hardware in general falls year on year. So with drones specifically, it's actually quite affordable to buy drones right now. The main financial barrier is going to be the cost of actually having people operate the drone, as well as the permissions required to operate it, right? So the main barrier to drone use again is not how expensive a drone is, but the other costs around it. Saying which, it's possible to buy drones in India which are legal to use for as low as maybe 30 or 40,000 rupees. And again, higher end drones can go for up to 20-25 lakhs, which is not something we would look at in the conservation sector. For the forest department using drones, there have been anti-poaching surveys conducted with drones. Again, it can be complicated because aside from the obvious ethical issues around using drones against your civilian populace, the fact is that with a dense canopy cover, for example, it can be hard to do. But these are again policing operations, and I know it can and has been done before. It's definitely financially viable.
All right, thank you. I think there are a couple more questions. One is regarding approval of drones in Himachal. I think you've already answered that regarding permissions across India. So I'm sure Srinivas can look into that. There is another question called, are you aware of any study involving tech on nesting of turtles in Andaman and Nicobar Islands?
Okay, so I'm not aware of any tech work in that area, but this is something which again the Nature Conservation Foundation and Dakshin Foundation would have more expertise on, because those are study sites they are familiar with. But again, I'm not familiar with drone use for turtle conservation in India other than what we've done recently.
All right, here's an interesting question. What are our everyday technology that are deemed inevitable that are causing irreversible harm on wildlife?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And something we think about all the time. Again, so I'll talk about one which is currently on top of my mind in terms of it's an everyday-ish technology. So I'm sure if people have heard about Bitcoin and blockchain in general, so that's something which is actually quite environmentally harmful, and especially with this recent addition of something called non-fungible tokens, which are, or NFTs, which are essentially blockchain to verified digital artwork. They're extremely hazardous because the carbon cost of some technology like Bitcoin, like Ethereum, all the other cryptocurrencies, which India is considering actually banning, which I think from an environmental perspective is a very good thing, is something which is irreversibly harmful for, like, from a larger global environmental perspective, in terms of the data being actually the data processing required to actually process any of those transactions. On a more basic level, again, technology, we talk about drones and satellites, but it's also email, it's also phone lines, it's also transmission lines and power. And that's something which is important to understand, because, for example, linear infrastructure such as transmission lines, such as railroads, they're really destroying India's habitat unless they're really planned properly. And that's something to keep in mind as well. That is a form of technology. A railroad, no matter how old, it is technology, and it is affecting wildlife habitat. And those are just, you can look around and see, just look at cars, for example, and then we can go down a whole rabbit hole of what is harmful, what is not harmful, and what is possible to avoid. But yeah, great question. Thanks.
Thank you, Shashank. There's another question from Dr. Yash Bhatnagar. Shashank, is your organization experimenting with affordable techs such as solar fences and camera traps?
So Dr. Bhatnagar, we aren't directly working with any of that tech. We have worked with camera trap data, but there are other people who are experts in this field. So again, the gap I felt existed was around the spatial analysis and the drone work specifically, which is what we focused on. But again, there are people out of Bangalore who are building camera traps which as an alternative to actually importing expensive one, and I can put you in touch with them separately if that's of interest.
All right, so going to our last questions, while there are a lot of questions in the Q&A section, I think we can just take one more. This is from Rakesh. He asks, how difficult is it to use drone in vast canopy covers? His concern is towards distribution and habitat use through presence data only.
So using drone over a vast canopy it's very hard. So some of the drones which exist now, you can actually use them to navigate through canopy itself, which is we've done, but you can't do much mapping work with that. When you fly it above a canopy, you can actually map the canopy itself, not what's under it. Saying which, what's changing quickly is the fact that LiDAR, so that's the use of laser technology to actually look at distance and to collect data. The cost of LiDAR is dropping rapidly, mainly because of the increase in self-driving car technology. All right. So again, I estimate that within 2 or 3 years, LiDAR on a drone is going to be cheap enough to actually use for large-scale conservation work. It's already been done and has been done in many places using either planes or even expensive drones with expensive equipment. But that technology is capable of penetrating canopies and actually giving you information on the understructure. So that's where I think, again, for heavily forested areas, that's where it makes sense to work with drones. Again, there's a reason why the 2 case studies I've spoken about today, one's on a beach and the other's in Ladakh where there aren't any trees. It's just because it makes sense to use drones in those contexts. It's appropriate for those landscapes. For a heavily canopy covered area, it might not be as appropriate.
All right, thank you. Just one more question from Virendra.
Sure.
How do you coordinate with locals for better production value?
So what our current protocol is that we go in, before we actually fly the drones, we go in and talk to local communities whose lands we might be flying over, show them the drone, tell them what data is collecting, show them how it works, maybe let them fly it a little bit as well, just to get a sense of what it means to actually have a drone. And after that, once we're done with the data collection itself, make sure the again, for better production value, I'm not sure if I understand. We're not video, we're not filmmakers, so we don't do regular video like that. We're not looking at production value as much as data collection, but we try and make sure that our data collection is being conducted as sensitively as possible. We actually have a report out on this, which it's up on our website as well, on the ethical use of drones in India, which goes into more detail about how to work with locals in this context.
All right, I think we can stop with the questions for today.
Sure.
We will compile all these questions and probably send them over to you so that we can, reply them back to the participants. So thank you very much, Shashank, for that wonderfully facilitated and enriching session, and for sharing your insights and experience, and also for answering so many of our questions.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It's really incredible to see how technology can be used, of course, appropriately, to propel and amplify conservation impact by making interventions more effective.
Thank you so much for everyone. I really enjoyed that session. Thanks.
Thank you, Shashank. All right, before we move ahead to our next segment, I'd like to point out that we have our last symposium coming Wednesday, that is the 24th of March, wherein we will have a distinguished panel of speakers, including Bahar Dutt, Associate Professor, School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Shiv Nada University, Delhi, who will be moderating a discussion on saving the lesser knowns. And in discussion will be Nayan Tara Jain from Reef Watch Marine Conservation, Parag Deka from Aranyak, Rajesh from Bat Conservation India Trust. In case you have not already registered for our final symposium, I have put the registration link here in the chat box. We will be very happy to welcome you on 24th also. I would now like to invite Trisha Ghosh and Tanya from the Habitats Trust to help us answer a few queries that we have received in our last symposium and discuss a few frequently asked questions. We will also be joined by our audit partners, Grant Thornton Bharat, for questions related to compliance and governance in the application form. I'd request participants to kindly use the Q&A function to type in any additional questions that you may have regarding the eligibility or application form, application process, evaluation criteria, etc. I'll also put a link to the application form for you in the chat box here, along with a link to the application form walkthrough video for your perusal. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Pooja. Okay, I hope I'm audible. Yes, I am. So to start with, Trisha, would be great if you can just help us out with these FAQs. We can move forward, Deepak. Yeah. So to start with, the most commonly asked question, can I include any other species that is not included in the 42 endangered species list mentioned in the grant guidelines?
So the simple answer to that is yes, we do accept proposals on species apart from the 42 indicative species that have been provided in the grant guidelines. But these species must be listed as either data deficit, endangered, critically endangered, or on IUCN, or on Schedule 1 of the Indian Wildlife Protection Act. And there should be a strong problem statement to support why you need to save the species.
Can I apply for conservation of flora or plant species?
Absolutely, yes, you can. And we actually include a few floral species in our indicative list of species as well.
Can I apply for more than one grant in one grant cycle?
No. So each year you can only apply under one grant category and put in one application for the grants process.
Can I email or post my application? That is, I think, send a hard copy of the application.
We only accept applications through our online portal, which is www.thehabitatstrust.org/grants. However, we have had some exceptional cases in the past, for example, internet lockdowns or natural disasters, which have caused telecommunication outages. You can write to the Habitats Trust team at thehabitatstrust@hcl.com. And if your case is seen to be genuine, then they may accept your application offline.
Next question. I work for a for-profit company/enterprise. Can I apply for the Conservation Hero Grant?
Yes, you can apply for the Conservation Hero Grant. As per the guidelines for the Conservation Hero Grant, you can't be a full-time employee of a not-for-profit organization, and you also should not be on the board of directors or the management committee of a not-for-profit registered in India.
Next, what is the difference between recommendations and references?
So this is a question we get asked very often. Recommendations, firstly, is only applicable for individual applicants. Recommendations can come from your mentors, they can come from your thesis professors, they can come from your guides, whoever. Anyone who's familiar with either your educational background, your qualifications, or your work in the field. On the other hand, references should technically come from people who understand your work on ground with the relevant to the proposal that you're putting in. So if you're putting in a proposal to save turtles in Odisha, it should be someone who's based there, someone who's seen your work there and can refer your work.
Okay. Next question. I have applied for my not-for-profits registration certificates, but I have not received them yet. Am I eligible to apply?
So our grant cycle is an 8 to 12 month cycle. We usually give people time till the sub-jury round to get these documents. If they've already applied first, they have to give us evidence that they have applied for these documents. And then there is a 6-month period from when you put in your application to the sub-jury round. You must acquire your documents by this time. If by the sub-jury round you have not acquired your documents, then we would be unable to take your application forward.
The next question is, can I apply for the same project applied for in the previous grant cycles?
So you can apply for the same project that you've applied for in the previous grant cycles, but what's very important and what we recommend is to get in touch with the Habitats Trust team and to also go through the grant guidelines again to understand why your proposal was unsuccessful the first time. If you put in an exactly same application, it's very likely that you'll again get an unfavorable result. So it's very important to understand where the lacunas were and to fill those gaps.
Next question. Can a professor or research scholar from an academic institute apply for the grant?
Yes, they can. So government registered institutions, that's, I think your section, Tanya just helped me out with that, section
3512.
3512. You can apply for the grants as an organization. Otherwise, if you're not with a government institution, which is a 3512, you can always apply for the individual grant.
Can a new not-for-profit organization apply for the grants for organizations?
So we have 3 grant categories for organizations. Unfortunately, a new organization would not be eligible for the strategic partnership grant, or where we have, as part of our guidelines, the organizations must be in functional existence for 5 years and with a minimum annual expenditure, including field expenses of 50 lakhs. However, new organizations can definitely apply for the Lesson on Habitats grant and the Lesson on Species grant.
Last question. Can a research association institute apply for the grant?
So I think this links back to what we were talking about with professors. Again, if you are a Section 35(1)(2), yes, you can apply for the grant in organizational categories. However, if you are not a Section 35(1)(2), and you are an individual who is part of an institution, then you can apply for the individual grant. Unfortunately, as a private institution or a private association, you won't be able to apply for the grant.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Trisha. I would now like to invite Grant Thornton, Bharat, to please help us address a couple of more queries. Deepak, we can move to the next slide. Great. My questions to Grant Bharat Thornton. These are very commonly asked questions. If Sudhi Chirag are here.
Sure, Tanya, I can pick it up.
Hi, Chirag.
Yeah, hi.
Okay, the first question to begin with, I do not have an ATG section, I do not have ATG 35(1)(2) 12A FCRA audited accounts. Can I apply for the strategic partnership grant?
Okay, so Tanya, first of all, the organization, it should be a registered entity, not for a profit entity in India. And to answer your question, an organization applying under strategic partnership grant, they must have a registration under section 12A ATG or section 35 clause 1 subsection 2 of Income Tax Act 1961, followed by the audited financials accounts for the financial year 2019-20.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Chirag. The next question is renewal of 12A and ATG under new registration procedure under section 12AB mandatory for applying the Habitats Trust grants?
Okay, so the new registration procedure prescribed under section 12AB for charitable trusts and other related provisions introduced in the Finance Act 2020, it has been deferred and extended to April 1st, 2021. Hence, the new provisions related to the charitable trusts and the other institutions shall now apply from the financial year 21-22.
Great. Thanks, Chirag. Next is, how do I register for my ATG and 12A certificate?
Okay, so there are two legs to it. So for registration under 12A and ATG, the organizations, they need to log on to the Income Tax Department e-filing portal, wherein they can access to Form 10A and 10G, which will be required for registration under 12A and ATG respectively. The list of documents that need to be annexed along with these forms are already mentioned on the forms itself. So after filling out the forms, these forms have to be verified by the person who is authorized to verify the return of income under section 140 as applicable to the assessee. And coming on to the new process, which will be required for registration under section 12AB, again, the applicants can log on to the e-filing portal of Income Tax Department, and they can follow the process mentioned thereon.
Great. Thank you so much, Chirag. So everybody can also drop us an email if they want an elaborate, step-by-step method of how to go about it. We're always here to help you out. Our email address is there in the chat box. Coming to the next question, is FCRA registration mandatory to apply for the grants for organizations categories?
No, since it's a domestic grant, FCRA registration is not mandatory.
Okay. Next question, expenditure of more than 50 lakh for strategic partnership grant should be pertaining to which financial year?
So it should be pertaining to the financial year 2019-20.
Last question for you, Chirag. What financial documents are needed to apply for the Conservation Hero Grant?
Okay, so an individual applying for Conservation Hero Grant, he or she must have a PAN card, Aadhaar card, bank statement, and proof of tax if applicable.
Okay, great. I think that's it for Grant Thornton. Thank you so much, Chirag, for helping us out.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you. There are many additional queries that are there in the chat box. I think most of them, all of us have covered, and those that were not covered, I think, thank you so much, Sunena, for getting back to everybody's query on the chat box. So I don't think there are any additional queries right now since we have covered everything during our FAQs. Pooja, right back to you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, team, for addressing all these queries. Going by the fact that our Q&A box is now empty, I hope that this session has resolved all of your queries. In case you still have any more queries that may have remained unanswered, or if you feel while filling out the application that there are a few questions unanswered, you can write to us. I have pasted the email in the chat box for all of you to refer to. Also, if you want, you can put the questions in the Q&A sections. We'll compile them and try to get back to you as soon as possible. Or you can also send it to us over email to kusum@csrbox.org. With this, we come to a close for today's symposium. Before wrapping up for the day, I would like to acknowledge and appreciate our esteemed speaker, Mr. Shashank Srinivasan, who took the time out of his busy schedule and showered us with his knowledge. We are truly humbled by your presence. Thank you once again. I would also like to extend my thanks to all of you for being such a wonderful audience, for asking such pertinent questions. Reiterating that we have another symposium lined up for 24th March, that is next Wednesday. Kusum from our team will paste the registration link for you again in the chat box, if in case you want to register. So stay tuned and do register. With this, we take your leave and wish you all a great day ahead.